Good evening, friends and community members. My name is Shanita Burney, and I am the Engagement and Partnerships Officer for DCPS. Welcome to our community information session on the FY 2023, otherwise known as FY23 budget. I'm joined here tonight by Chancellor Louis D. Ferebee, Sharon Gaskins, who's our Resource Strategy Officer, and Kevin Wenzel, who's our Deputy Chief of Finance. In a moment, I'll review the agenda and purpose for today, but first wanted to let you know that the session is being recorded so that we can share this afterwards, and we'll be doing a Q&A through a moderated format based on questions we've received through a variety of spaces, including our student and parent engagements this fall, a public hearing we held on earlier this month on November 9th, and also that folks wrote in when they RSVP'd through Eventbrite. So if we look at the agenda here, folks will see what we have planned today. We'll start off with a budget overview. This will allow for you to get really anchored in a Budget 101 overview of how the DCPS budget is developed. Then we'll hear more about the FY23 budget model overview. And then, as I mentioned, I'll share a little bit more through our panelists, through some discussion that we'll have with them through a moderated Q&A. And then we'll close out with next steps, process, and timeline. As a reminder, if you need Spanish interpretation, please use the link that's reflected on the screen, bit.ly/DCPS Español. Want to share what our goals and objectives are for this session tonight. You'll see here that reflected also through the agenda we just shared that we'll provide an overview of the key budget components for our DCPS budget. We'll continue this dialogue we've been having about how we are prioritizing resources to address the specific needs of all of our schools. We'll share information on how we plan to allocate funding to schools in a revised budget model that focuses on student needs. And we'll also increase awareness of this revised operating budget model, what it means for schools and what it means for our district. And then we'll answer questions around the DCPS budget process and the FY23 budget model. So a lot that we want to cover today, and as we kick it off, I'm going to pass it over to Sharon Gaskins, again, our Strategy Resource Officer, to share more with you about the DCPS budget overview and cycle.
Thank you so much, Shanita. It's great to be here with everyone tonight. As Shanita previewed, before we dive into talking about our fiscal year 2022-2023 budget model, I do want to share just a bit of information about how school budgets are developed and how the DCPS annual budget cycle operates. So first, in terms of our school budget process, on the left, there are 4 key steps involved, which I'll talk through briefly. First, our enrollment projections. These enrollment projections are created by analyzing current trends in student enrollment to really make a prediction about what enrollment will look like. Enrollment is captured on October 5th of each year. That's the official enrollment audit date set by the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, or OSSE. DCPS uses this process to calculate total school-wide enrollment in addition to the enrollment of special populations, such as students with disabilities and English language learners and other populations of students. Next, each school is provided an initial school funding amount, which is based on each school's unique population and what the school funding model generates. Next, school principals and their local school advisory teams, or LSATs, gather input from their communities to create a budget that allocates funds for both required positions and reflects decisions made around flexible funds. And then finally, DCPS compiles and submits all school budgets in addition to the budget of central office to the mayor, which goes to DC Council for approval, along with the overall budget for district government. And to the right, you'll see these steps in a sequential order. Initial allocations for schools published to our budget website as the starting point, followed by school budget development, which includes opportunities for stakeholder engagement and technical assistance, which eventually culminates in a final submitted school budget. I also want to share some key budget components for DCPS and distinguish between our operating budget versus our capital budget. Our operating budget, which is primarily funded by the Uniform Per Student Funding Formula, or the UPSFF, supports our day-to-day operations, including staff needed for activities like instruction, curriculum programs, resources, and targeted supports for students. The capital budget supports investments and improvements in facilities and related infrastructure. So as the slide outlines, some examples of expenses that are covered by our operating budget include educators and staff, education program and materials, support services, and compliance activities. Our capital budget covers expenses like modernizations, which are really large-scale, multi-year renovations that turn school buildings into brand new learning spaces for our schools and our students and staff. Schools are prioritized for modernization in alignment with the PACE Act, which I'll talk about more in a bit. And also under the capital budget, we have small capital projects, which you may hear too referred as small caps, which are smaller renovation projects that solve a specific problem, like improving an HVAC system, improving playgrounds and fields, and other infrastructure updates. Small cap projects are typically completed within one fiscal year and are implemented really with a focus of supporting schools around their occupancy needs, comfort of students or staff, or programmatic needs. These projects may also allow us to ensure compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, for example. We may need to install an elevator or replace an elevator in a school building. And similar to the operating budget, which we'll be talking about tonight, there is a process for determining our capital budget through the capital improvement plan. So I'll just review that briefly for you. The CIP is a 6-year plan that identifies capital projects for each fiscal year. Each year, these funds are proposed alongside the mayor's operational budget. The Planning Actively for Comprehensive Education and Facilities Amendment Act, that is a mouthful, that's why we call it the PACE Act. It outlines how school modernization planning will be completed using 4 measures outlined here: equity, student demand, neighborhood population, and current building condition. And using this measure, the collection of these measures, the CIP outlines funds to both design and to construct modernize school buildings and complete those small capital projects I mentioned earlier. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to the Chancellor to talk about our fiscal year 2022-2023 school funding model.
Thank you, Ms. Gaskins. Again, it's a pleasure to be with you this evening to share a little bit more about our plans for the fiscal year 23 budget model. So we think about where we are, we're continuing to refine the way we think about how dollars are allocated to schools. I'm going to share some key principles in how we continue to iterate on our current budget process. But you may be wondering why now, especially given the unique year that we're in and return to in-person learning. Why is DCPS thinking about continuing to shift in different directions as relates to the budget allocation model? And there are key things I want to highlight here. And one is that we believe that we are definitely on a strong path of recovery. And we will continue to dig deep into our strengths and the way that we support our schools to build back stronger than before. We also believe that adapting our budget model aligns well with some of the key principles that we are working towards as a part of our aims for how dollars flow to schools. And that is, one, to ensure that we have the appropriate allocation of resources of staff to each school. But we also understand that our current model, while it allocates staff to school, it can be limited based on a staff to student ratio model alone. We also have gotten feedback that we are often producing budgets that are unpredictable, and not easily understood by the community, and oftentimes lacks flexibility for more targeted supports that schools and local school advisory teams may identify as needs based on the local context that they have of their school and school community. So we believe this approach is on track with what the heard from our community as it relates to the feedback received. And we also believe that this provides another element of transparency. And so as we think about those key elements I just outlined, I do want to refine that a little bit and share with you what the key principles are as we're thinking about the ground rules and the key principles for developing this current budget model. And the first is equity. We know now more importantly than any time before, it's important that we intentionally put forth resources and significant amount of funding for student need. We want to ensure that we're meeting students where they are. As I mentioned earlier, we want to continue to refine where we are with transparency. So there's a clear flow for everyone to follow of how dollars are received for DCPS, and then how those dollars are allocated directly to schools, and what flexibility schools have with the dollars received. And then finally, we want to produce a budget model that is sustainable. We know that there's been some unpredictability in how dollars have flowed to schools in our financial landscape. And so we want to ensure that schools can rely on a consistent model that's predictable year over year as they think about planning for how dollars will be allocated and what staff and supports can be identified. To do that, DCPS is simplifying our model into 3 funding streams that will be a part of how dollars will be allocated to school. So you can see on the slide, there are 3 streams that will go directly to schools. And the first stream will be the largest portion of funding, which is our enrollment stream. This will include baseline funding that will go directly to schools. And this will, again, will be the majority of the funding that goes to school, and it will be based on student enrollment. So whether you're elementary, middle school, high school, we'll look at the number of students in your building to dictate your allocation, and we will also ensure that you have administrative staff and other supports as well. The second stream, which will be the second to largest stream, is what we're calling targeted supports. Here we're providing a supplement of funding designed to meet students where they are and to support special populations. So this can include students identified as at risk, our special education services, our English language learner services that will go to schools. And here is where schools would receive additional dollars to support those efforts. And then finally, our last area is stability. As I mentioned earlier, we want budgets to be predictable, where schools can rely on a steady source of funding. And we also want to ensure that we minimize shifts year over year. So as a result, we will be conducting what we call a stability check to ensure that each budget meets our minimum standards for how dollars will be supporting schools to ensure a successful school year. We will set minimum standards for example, supports for mental health or administrative staff or support staff. And once the school has been provided their enrollment dollars and their targeted support dollars, we'll apply this safety net to determine if the school is eligible for stability dollars, and they could receive that in addition to their enrollment and targeted support funds. So again, these are the 3 streams of dollars that we will be allocating to schools this school year. Each school budget will reflect those dollars and will provide budget detail for each of those areas that I've just outlined. So what does this mean for schools? We believe this means there will be greater transparency in how dollars are allocated to schools. So for example, you're here later tonight, part of the additional funding that will go to schools and targeted support is at-risk funding. You know, this is something that families and community members have been looking to get more clarity around and how schools are transparently receiving and allocated these dollars. There'll be more flexibility for school leaders and local school advisory teams, given that many of the dollars will be allocated not on a ratio, but on a per student funded formula. And then finally, we believe this aligns well with our desire to meet students where they are and to target needs. Again, we can do this through the targeted supports, but also the enrollment funding can also be utilized to target certain supports as well. We believe that even though this is a different approach than what we've done in the past, it does incorporate the best of both worlds of what we had previously in our comprehensive staffing model and then what we're thinking for the current school year. So with that said, I'm going to turn it now over to Kevin Wenzel on our budget team, who's going to share a little bit more about what an actual school budget will look like with these three streams of funding. And again, that's enrollment, targeted supports, and stability. Thank you. I'll turn it over to you, Kevin.
Great, thank you, Chancellor. Good evening, everybody. Again, my name is Kevin Wenzel, Deputy Chief of Finance for DC Public Schools. I'm going to spend my time with you all tonight talking a little bit more deeply about these different funding streams, talking a little bit more deeply about the at-risk and how at-risk plays out in this funding model, and then looking at some specific examples of what this could look like for an elementary school, a middle school, and a high school under varying enrollments and mixes of student need. So first, taking a look at what this may look like for schools, this is a little bit more detail on what the student-based funding portion of this model would look like. So as you can see, the three categories that the Chancellor just highlighted, enrollment, targeted support, and stability, are along the top of the chart. In the next line down, you see the weights. The base weight, which is what every student K-12 would generate, is in this first enrollment bucket that would go to everywhere you see a check mark. So each of these different grade band types of schools, elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, and education campuses would receive that base weight in their enrollment category. Next, in the targeted support category, this is where we see additive multiplier weights, recognizing that schools that serve student mixes of higher need more funds in order to support those students. So we have additive multiplier weights for students who need English language learner services, students who need special education services, students who are in pre-K, and students who are designated as at-risk, particularly at schools that are serving high percentages of at-risk students. So again, elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, and education campuses, depending on their unique mix of students and student needs, will receive those additive multiplier weights in their student-based funds through the targeted support funding stream. And finally, on the stability funding stream, the Chancellor mentioned the safety net check. This is where we're going to see if a school is generating enough funds through their student-based funds, the base weight, and the additive multiplier weights in the previous two columns in order to support a minimum level of service. So some draft examples of what that might look like are that you have enough funding for non-personnel supplies, for your general education teachers, assistant principals, instructional coaches, guidance counselors, and clerks. Shifting to, again, focusing in on that targeted supports category, I want to talk a little bit more about at-risk funding. Sharon mentioned earlier that our operating budget is mostly funded by the Uniform Per Student Funding Formula, also known as the UPSFF. Within the UPSFF, there are two at-risk funding weights. One weight is for all students who are identified as at-risk, and then there's an additional supplemental weight, new in fiscal year 22, that's for students who are overage in high school, which is one of the at-risk characteristics for the total definition. So there are two different ways that the UPSFF allocates at-risk funding. In this model, schools will be allocated supplemental at-risk dollars as grant allocations. So there'll be these dollars, which are specifically designated for students identified as at-risk via the UPSFF, will be allocated and they will show up to schools as grants. So what does that mean? This funding will be allocated per pupil that is at risk, and there will be increased flexibility for principals and school communities to determine the types of resources that they want to use that at-risk funding for in order to support their at-risk students. So this would be on top of the allocated staffing levels that we talked about before. Okay, we're going to next talk about a few examples. We're going to look first at an elementary school example and spend the most time here so that I can orient you to the slide and what this is showing. We'll then look at a middle school example and then finally at a high school example. So first, with this elementary school example, there's a couple of things that I want to orient you to before we jump into the numbers. First, you see that the three funding stream categories that the Chancellor mentioned in that pyramid slide are over on the left. So you have the enrollment category, which is at the top in this case. Enrollment provides the baseline funding. The next category is the targeted supports category. And then the final category is the stability category. So that's the 3 categories along the left. The next column shows what some of those examples might be of resources that would fall within that funding stream category. So I already mentioned right at the top, the base weight, which is the base funding that all students kindergarten through 12 would generate, is based on a number of students that you have in your building. You see here that it shows 330 students. In this case, under this set of conditions, these 330 students through their base weight are generating $2.1 million. So what might that buy? You can see in the next line, this would go toward things like school leadership, your general education teachers, administrative folks, social, emotional, and other kinds of support and instructional support staff. So that's what's being generated by the base weight there. We also know that there are some student types that need specific resources allocated by staff. So that's very similar to how we currently do it in the comprehensive staffing model. We take a certain number of ratios for resources and students, and we allocate the resource as staff. So this is especially going to be true, as you see here, for special education teachers, aides, and staff. This particular school is generating 19 full-time equivalents, 19 positions, and $1.4 million for those positions. Similar to that is the next line for English language learner teachers, aides, and staff. For this particular school, under these conditions, they're generating 2 FTE and $0.2 million, or $200,000 in this case. These aren't the only resources that will allocate as staff in this enrollment bucket. The next group, which is labeled as other, includes folks like your early childhood education or ECE teachers, your principal, mental health supports, and your custodial staff. So all in total, for this example, would generate 22 full-time equivalents, or FTE, and $1.9 million in that final column for that group of resources. So that's the enrollment category, which we think of as the base of our pyramid, where the majority of our resources are going to flow to different schools. The next is considering your targeted supports. So right at the top, you see the UPSFF at-risk grant. This is the at-risk grant that I talked about in the previous slide. For this school, they have 169 students who are categorized as at risk. This is sending that funding directly to the school, which is about $400K. Under the code, schools get 90%, and then we hold back 10% at Central for other kinds of at-risk supports. So this $400K is going right to schools in order to have a more transparent and more flexible spending grant for these at-risk funds. On top of the UPSFF's at-risk funds, we also know that schools that serve high percentages of at-risk students may have additional needs relative to schools that serve low percentages of at-risk students. So what we have here in the next 2 lines are for every student that are above certain thresholds of at-risk, we're going to give that school additional funding from our other funds, not at-risk funds, but from our other funds. So in this case, this school, while it has 169 at-risk students, it has 40 students that are above that 40% threshold. So they're generating that additional funding in the last column, the $0.05 million or $50,000. We also know that it's not just at-risk students that need additional resources. We have English language learners, special education students, students in pre-K. All of those student types may need some additional resources as well. So what you see here for each of those student types are an enrollment projection, and then again, the funding that is associated with that. Importantly, as I mentioned before, this is not the only place that students who need English language learner services or students who need special education services will receive their resources. We're going to, if you go back to the top part, the enrollment bucket, we're going to allocate special education teachers and English language learner teachers as a staffing allocation. The purpose of the additional funding down here is just to recognize that schools that serve higher needs groups of students, like English language learners and students with special education needs, we need to drive more funding to those schools out of our principle of equity. The last 2 lines in this targeted supports bucket are some non-local examples. So Title I is a federal program. The school would continue to receive their Title I allocation, which in this case is about $100,000, $0.1 million. And then you see at the last line, an after-school program. This may be another federally funded program, generating, in this case, $300,000 for this school, or $0.3 million. The final bucket, now that we've covered enrollment and targeted supports for this elementary school, is ensuring stability. So these are the stabilization funds that a school would generate. In this case, we apply the safety net to see if the school is generating enough funds in order to achieve that draft safety net that we described before. Do they have enough for their general education teachers? Do they have enough for their instructional coach? Do they have enough for a clerk, etc.? So we want to make sure that they're doing that. In this case, they are generating enough funds, so they are not getting any safety net funds because they don't need them in this case. However, what they do need is stabilization relative to the year prior. So what you can see in this final line with stabilization is that this school may, from the year prior, have decreased in enrollment. But we know that we have to keep a school at least at 95% of their previous year's budget according to the code. So what this $0.3 million or $300,000 is doing is making sure that we are keeping in alignment with that existing stabilization requirement. This school then, down in bold, generates $7.1 million. That's the sum total of everything that you see in the final column across the enrollment bucket, the targeted supports bucket, and the stability bucket for this elementary school. One note before we move to the next example is that this is not a specific DCPS school. This is an example school with example enrollment, just to show what this could look like at a specific school. And that's going to be the same for our middle school example and our high school example that we'll look at next. Great, so this is going to be a very similar looking slide. Same three funding streams that we started out with. We have enrollment at the top, we have targeted supports in the middle, and we have ensuring stability at the bottom. In this case, we have a similarly sized school where 290 students. But what we also see if you go down into the targeted supports column is that they have many more as a percentage at-risk students. So of those 290 students at the top at this school, all of which are generating the base weight and $1.9 million for their school, they have 200 of them are identified as at-risk. And in this case, because they are hitting each of the at-risk thresholds, they are also generating more funding in that targeted support for schools that serve high percentages of at-risk students. So to just run down the line like we did with the previous example, the 290 students are generating about $1.9 million. That's that top line. That's from the base weight in the student-based funding portion of this weight. That again will go towards folks like school leadership, general education teachers, other kind of administration and social emotional supports, and instructional supports. Special education teachers and English language learner teachers, the next two lines, those are going to continue to be allocated as staffing allocations in this enrollment bucket. You see, if you go down into the targeted supports column, they have about 90 students who have special education needs, which means that they're generating many special education teachers in the enrollment bucket as a staffing allocation. We have other positions that are also allocated as staffing allocations, which include principals for mental health supports and custodials. So that's that 8 full-time equivalents and $0.7 million or $700,000 in this case. Moving into the targeted supports for this school, we've talked about the at-risk. So the top line is that at-risk grant, 200 students, about $500,000 in this case. They're also generating the next two lines, as I mentioned, the additional weights for schools that are serving high percentages of at-risk students in alignment with our equity principle. And then, of course, our English language learners and special education students, those are each generating some additional funding via the student-based funds as well. Since this is a middle school, they don't have any pre-K students, so they're not generating that or leveraging that weight in order to generate more funds for their schools. Yeah, the Title I allocation, again, a federal program, and then budget assistance. Moving into the ensuring stability category, this school, again, we applied the safety net check to see if they're generating enough funds. In this case, they are generating enough funds to be able to provide that minimum level of support. So we are not, there's no need to give them the additional funding for the safety net in this case. They are, however, similar to the previous school that we looked at, the elementary school. This school likely had a decrease in enrollment from last year to this year, where they have 290 students. So we're keeping them at that 95% stabilization rate per the code, which means that we have to give them about $700,000 in order to make sure that there's stability year to year. The sum here in this case is that $6.2 million. That's the total of everything in the right-hand column across enrollment, targeted supports, and stability. And finally, we're going to take a look at a high school example. Again, this slide should look pretty familiar in terms of format. You have the enrollment, targeted supports, and stability on the left. This In this case, this school is very large. So we've looked at a couple of smaller to medium-sized schools. This school has 2,500 students. So that 2,500 students through the base rate in this top line for the enrollment bucket is generating about $16.2 million. So we know, again, this will go towards folks like school leaderships, administration, your social, emotional, and instructional support staff. They're also generating many special education teachers and many English language learner teachers as direct staffing allocations based on those populations within their school. And then there's other folks that are received as special, or excuse me, as direct staffing allocations like your principal and mental health supports and custodial. 10 FTE full-time equivalents there, about $1 million to close out the enrollment bucket. We know too that this school, because they're a high school, they may have specialty programming that are specific to high schools, like career and technical education or CTE, the JROTC, and other kinds of needs that are specific to high schools. So they're generating $1.3 million as that baseline funding enrollment bucket to wrap up that funding stream. Moving into targeted supports, again, we have the at-risk grant right there at the top. They have many at-risk students because they are a very large school, so 467 of their 2,500 students. They're generating about $1.3 million in that at-risk grant for their schools. However, because they are not serving a very high percentage of their total population, they are not hitting the thresholds needed for the additional at-risk allocations via the student-based rate. So you see that you have 0 students above 40% and 0 students above 70% for that at-risk additional student-based rate. They do have many English language learners. Again, not the only place that you're going to see English language learners generating funding because we're allocating a staff in the enrollment bucket, but English language learners and special education students are going to generate between them $0.3 million and $0.6 million respectively, just under $1 million in total for those groups, driving that towards this school. Finally, again, high school specific in this middle bucket, specifically are going to have evening credit recovery and pathways programs generating about $200,000 or $0.2 million for their school. This school, again, took a look at the safety net. They're generating enough funds to be able to provide the resources that would be provided by a safety net, so they don't need the safety net in this case. And this school also may not have been decreasing in enrollment. They may be steady in enrollment or growing in enrollment. So they don't leverage the stabilization or need the leverage of the stabilization fund either, because they are, relative to their prior year's budget, are holding pretty steady. So all in all, if you total up everything on the right-hand side, you get to about $25 million for this school. And I think that covers all of our examples here. So I will turn to Shanita to talk through our Q&A.
Thank you, Kevin. So thank you to Chancellor, Sharon, and Kevin for talking us through an overview of the DCPS budget and an overview of the FY23 budget model as well. We're going to take, as I mentioned at the top of the meeting, of some questions that we have received quite a bit from a variety of places, including student and family engagement sessions this fall. We had a recent budget hearing on November 9th, earlier this month, as well as folks were writing in questions as they RSVP through our Eventbrite system. And so there were some common themed questions that we're going to pose to the panelists that will allow them to go into even more detail about what they've just shared. The first question that I'll lift up is for the Chancellor. And this question is, how will at-risk students be prioritized under the revised model?
Thank you, Ms. Burney, for that question. It's certainly something that we thought a lot about. As you heard me say earlier, one of the areas where we wanted to provide greater clarity for the community is how at-risk dollars that we receive from our government funding, how that is translated into dollars to schools. And previously, that was baked into our comprehensive staffing model where you couldn't see a clear through line. We're proud that we've created in what we call the targeted supports a clear line of funding stream where you can see dollars go directly to students that are identified at risk. Of course, DCPS is committed to ensuring that every student receives a high quality education and the resources needed to be successful. But we're really proud that the revised model provides a unique way of being flexible for school leaders and administrators to address student need, specifically through the targeted support. So I want to call that out, that it not only provides direct funding that can support students that are identified at risk, but also other targeted supports that we've identified or a school may identify as well.
Great. And on a related note, Chancellor, you talked a little bit about this just now, but if you could go into even more detail around how this new budget model is going to help schools that serve majority low-income student populations, what will that look like for them?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So we certainly want to ensure that one of our priorities in this process is to ensure, as I said earlier, that there's an equitable education across the district and that we're meeting all those students where they are. We're also providing school leaders more flexibility. I can't reiterate that enough because we know that oftentimes school leaders, local school advisory team, just have more information and access to context that we don't have. So in this revised budget, not only do we provide additional dollars through the targeted supports for special populations or students that have additional need, but we also ensure that we keep an eye on the essential programs that serve all students through our enrollment dollars and also through the safety net. And it's also important to know that as a part of this model, we have a clear process for at-risk funding through the uniform per student funding formula, and also it's coupled with flexibility and grants for at-risk enrollment. So we definitely consider that many of our students do come with additional needs. And then finally, I do want to call out that in addition to the at-risk dollars we receive as a part of the uniform per student funding formula, we also receive Title I dollars that support students who need additional resources as well, and that will be included in each school's budget.
Thank you, Chancellor. I know that that's a question that many people are interested in understanding and learning more about, so thanks for sharing more context there. The next question I have is for Kevin Wenzel, who again is our Deputy Chief of Finance. Kevin, one of the questions that folks have is if DCPS schools will lose money under this revised model. Can you share a response to that?
Yeah, thank you, Shanita. I think it's an important question, and I think what I would respond to is that under the revised model, the funds will align to student enrollment and targeted student needs. So we know that we had those three buckets. We had starting with enrollment was the base bucket. So we know that enrollment shifts are going to help to determine what a school receives, but also that we have that stability check built in so that even if a school is seeing large declines in enrollment, we know that they are able to be kept steady to a certain extent from year to year through that stability check that we had at the top of the pyramid that we talked about earlier.
And another question for you, if you can explain how flexibility with the new budget model differs from the previous budget model.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing I would share is that we think that this model as a hybrid model has some of the best things of a staff-based allocation model, like what we are coming from, the comprehensive staffing model, and a just full-on student-based funding model. So we know that that by having certain funding streams, we'll have some specific tags to certain resources. So I talked earlier about special education teachers and English language learner teachers. We know that we need to allocate those folks as staff, but there will be other funds where school leaders and administrators can determine how they should be used to best meet the needs of their students. A good example of this being the at-risk funding that we talked about before, having increased flexibility relative to where we're coming from in the previous year's model. And again, I'll point to the stability allocation. We know that we will take a look at the safety net to make sure that folks are generating enough funding and that they are able to then determine what mix of resources they need for their students in order to make sure that they are successful academically.
Thank you. There's a question that we have that I'll actually answer. around our local school advisory teams, or LSATs as we call them in DCPS. And presumably the majority of folks tuning in are familiar with LSATs, but for those who aren't, these are school-based groups that serve as advisory groups to the principal, the school leader, and consist of teachers and staff, but as well families and community members, and in some cases students. And so they play a substantive role in informing the budget for schools each year. And so one of the questions that we received is, what are the key deadlines and important information for LSATs to know in assisting principals with the budget in the new model? And so I'll share that annually LSATs have multiple opportunities during the budget season to learn about the budget process. They get key dates, they get best practices around engagement, and the first webinar around enrollment projections already occurred. There'll be 2 more budget webinars and additional opportunities for engagement in early 2022, so at the beginning of the new year. There's also an LSAT newsletter for all members and an online LSAT toolkit with robust guidance materials and more. And for anyone who is on who's joining us is a part of the LSAT and would like to receive that LSAT newsletter or get access to that LSAT toolkit, feel free to send us an email at ceo.info@k12.dc.gov. So the next question is for Sharon Gaskins, who again is our school resource officer. And the question is, are there any costs currently funded by central office being shifted to the school level? Essentially, will schools be expected to fund anything that they are not currently funding?
Great question, and no, that is not planned.
Love it.
That was
Straight
easy.
to the point. Good answer. Kevin, talk a little bit about, one of the questions that we got was, why has this budget model not taken into account the budgetary needs of larger schools? And so understanding that this individual and others often feel this way, that students in larger schools per pupil go underfunded in favor of smaller schools. And so can you explain a little bit again, I know you talked about this with the scenarios across the different grade bands, but can you talk a little bit around the rationale here and how this actually plays out across larger schools?
Yeah, I think so. If we were to think back to the kind of pyramid slide that we looked at before, we know the majority of the resources are going to flow through that enrollment bucket. So that's going to be directly influenced by the number of students that you have. And we think that that means in a couple of ways that this model will be adaptable for schools of all sizes. So we're going to ensure that we can meet the needs of students that are at small schools, students that are at large schools, and of course through the targeted supports, schools of any different size, and we have very varying sizes across the across DCPS, will receive the funding needed to meet their special populations as well. So I think we're pretty confident that the needs of larger schools will be met in this new model, as well as schools of every size across our district.
Great, thank you. Sharon, coming back to you, is the following model provided in this session that we're sharing today? Is that final?
Another really good question. So I'll start by saying that what we're presenting tonight, we believe represents a model that really reflects the feedback and direction of our stakeholders. We've been at this work for several years now, engaging people at school levels, our community partners, students, and we've heard a real strong desire to create a model, as we've been saying time and time again, that's transparent, equitable, and provides stability. And we've also heard as the Chancellor referenced and Kevin referenced as well, that there are strengths in our current funding model that we can build upon. And so with that, we believe this hybrid model strikes the right balance and really best meets the needs of our communities. That being said, while the core building blocks of this model that we present tonight are finalized, we recognize that there is still more work ahead of us for this budget cycle. We will be refining key elements of the model to ensure that it really achieves our goals as we prepare and carry out our budget development processes this season. So there's a lot more work to do with our school communities, our LSAT stakeholders, our school leaders and others, and we're really excited for what lies ahead.
Thanks, Sharon. Chancellor, from the student budget hearings that we held on November 3rd and 8th with middle school students and high school students, we heard resoundingly that more mental health supports are needed in both middle and high. Any thoughts on that and how DCPS will continue to support this through the FY23 budget?
Yes, certainly some thoughts on the feedback we receive, and I want to call out that we not only get that feedback from our students, from our families, parents, guardians as well, but I can't say enough about the way the students advocated, lean into those conversations, so I'm grateful for their feedback. I want to give some numbers though to start this conversation, just to give context that DCPS is a national leader as it relates to mental health investments. We've got 135 psychologists, 237 school social workers, 141 counselors, 132 community-based organizations that we partner with to serve our schools. So you can just get a sense of the level of investment that we're making. If you put all that together, we've got over 640 mental health professionals in our schools every day, which is far better than what you would see in the national average and what's recommended nationally. And in fact, what's recommended nationally is a 1-to-25 ratio. In DCPS, we're at 1-to-22. Now, we know we can get better. We're not just satisfied at that 1-to-22, and we'll continue to lean into ways in which we can add additional layers of support. What's, I think, unique about DCPS is we give schools the flexibility to customize their mental health supports. So you can see some schools double down in social workers. Some schools utilize their counselors in different ways. So we want to continue to provide that level of flexibility. This year, we're also proud that we launched our restorative justice coordinators. We have deans that are taking on different roles and responsibilities. We've asked our security staff to change their role. We've got in-school suspension coordinators, behavior technicians, a wide range of individuals that we have in the mix, and then we're also training. So we want our staff to be well-versed on all the best practices for being responsive to mental health needs. While we know there's no replacement for clinicians, and we'll continue to add clinicians as needed, we do see this as a benefit. And then finally, what I'm excited about, speaking of our students, is our student ambassador program. So this year we started a youth mental health ambassador program at our high schools. And it's great to see peer-led conversations around reducing the stigma associated with trauma, identifying supports for trauma. And we believe that these active conversations among students are just the beginning of how we can continue to spread the word and ensure that students are comfortable for raising their hand, and we also have a caring adult available to address any needs that they may have. So we'll continue to work on this area. We're definitely not in a position to run a victory lap yet, but it is something that we have prioritized and will continue to prioritize.
Thank you. Our final question that we'll answer tonight is, again, coming to you, Chancellor. We recently had a public hearing with the City Council where we heard concerns around technology and equity. And we got this question as well in the Eventbrite signups. And so want to ask you, what are the plans to provide digital technology for all DCPS students to access online learning tools like laptops, tablets, hotspots, learning apps, and tech help?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's certainly one that was produced out of the public health emergency when we needed to pivot to remote learning. But DCPS had a plan prior to that, and that was our Empowered Learners Initiative. I'm proud that we were able to realize our goal of a 1-to-1 ratio in grades 3 through 12 with every student with a device. And we were able to move that through faster than what we had planned. We've invested over $5 million in internet access in a number of different ways. We actually now have some unique internet access opportunities for schools that are utilizing outdoor spaces, in addition to some of the solutions you mentioned earlier, such as hotspots. And it's also important to note that DCPS has purchased devices that are Wi-Fi enabled. But we know we still have more work to do, which is why we're continuing to prioritize technology investments in our capital budgets. It's important to note that it is on the capital side. I know that we mentioned earlier when Ms. Gaskins was speaking that there are differences between funding streams. And so we're talking about the capital work. We want you to know that we're also prioritizing, in addition to building out a strong network and devices, we know our smart boards are an area where there's interest. So we're exploring options to refresh smart boards across the district. We know that they're aging. We also will continue to replenish aging devices across the district. We're expecting to invest another $10 to $15 million a year in refreshing student and educator devices to ensure that our life cycle is strong. We don't want a device that is beyond 3 years of age, and we believe that this will allow for the best and most efficient use of our technology. So we have a number of strategies in place. We'll continue to blend in local dollars, federal dollars, as we've done over the past 3 years to continue to ensure that our technology access is strong.
Thank you again, Chancellor. Thank you to Sharon Gaskins and Kevin Wenzel, who again lead our school resource office where our budget and finance team sits, and for answering many of the questions that folks have and are top of mind, and again for talking us through our budget process and what FY23 will look like. I would love to pass it to Sharon Gaskins to close us out with sharing a little bit around our next steps around our process and timeline.
Excellent, thank you. And so before we close, I do want to share a little bit about where we've been with our budget development process and where we're going as we enter this upcoming budget development season. So in terms of where we've been, if you've been along with us over the past several months, we've really been focused on engagement. We had a town hall in August about our budget model. We've engaged parents, principals, a dedicated principal task force that we've convened, all with the goal of getting feedback and sharing insights on this budget model that we're sharing with you today. We are squarely in the November portion of our timeline, right in the middle, where we are continuing the engagement. As you've heard earlier this evening, we've had really exciting opportunities to engage with our students over the past several weeks, our middle school students, our high school students, to hear about their budget priorities. Our public hearing last week when we heard from our broad swath of community stakeholders, and shifting to our LSAT engagement, all critical parts of what make our budget process work. And then also during this time frame, as I mentioned earlier, a key portion of our funding model is enrollment. And over the next few weeks, those enrollment projections for schools, you know, what we project for each school to have in terms of student enrollment overall and for our student populations, those projections will be released. And then moving onward in the new year, that LSAT engagement will continue through school leader roundtables and LSAT roundtables. Initial school budget allocations will be released, and that technical assistance support that's provided to school leaders and school teams will be continued, and ultimately school budgets will be finalized. So that is a bit about the work ahead. And so we will, we've said it a few times, but we'll say it again. Just continue to encourage you to stay involved. Likely if you're on this call with us, you are involved. So I'll say one step further, please bring someone else along with you, both to participate in school level planning activities for your budget and even to get involved with your LSAT. And for more information about any part of our school budgeting process, you'll see our email address at the bottom of the screen, dcps.schoolfunding@k12.dc.gov. So with that, I will close. Thank you for your time, your dedication to our students in schools, and we look forward to talking again soon.